Okay. Here they come. Here they come. Okay, Jeanette, would you be able to just put a note in the other chat?
Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. Let's see. Welcome, everyone. Apologies. We had a little bit of technical challenges this morning, but par for 2020, so here we are. We're just going to let everybody start to sign in. I have just a handful of emails that I've gotten for folks. I'm just going to tell them really quickly where to go so they can get in as well.
Looks like a number of folks have figured it out because we've got about 90 so far, 91.
Yay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for everybody that's already reading directions on the screen. If you want to, go ahead and put your name and pronouns and organization into the chat. That would be awesome so we can know who's here. We're gonna have a lot of people from all around Maine and beyond this morning. So welcome. Right. Oh yeah, we've got folks coming in from all over the state. This is so exciting. Okay. I think we're going to go ahead and get started just for the sake of time. Again, apologies for the technical difficulties that we had this morning, but just glad everybody is here now. So I would love to start by introducing myself. My name is Sarah Lentz. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Senior Manager of Membership and Programs here at MPC. And as I said before, I'm just super grateful to be sharing this space with all of you this morning. Before we start our actual program, I did just want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we are occupying here in Maine, and this statement is adapted from the Abbey Museum. We meet today in the homeland of the Wabanaki, the people of the dawn. We extend our respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous people and their ancestors whose rich histories and vibrant communities have lived here for thousands and thousands of generations in which is known today as Maine. We make this acknowledgement aware of continual and present violations of water, territorial rights, and sacred sites in the Wabanaki homeland. I hope that as we gather today to learn more about giving in Maine, that we reflect on these words and think deeply about how we intend to do better for this land and the original nations of this land. And for those of you who might be new to Maine Philanthropy Center, this is your first program that you're attending, I wanted to give a little bit of context about who we are. So we're a network of over 300 nonprofit members and more than 70 of Maine's funding stakeholder members. So as our network, we really believe in collective impact, and everything that we do at MPC is really focused on creating a strong community invested in enhancing the effectiveness of funders. We bring together leaders in the nonprofit and foundation worlds to really have deep conversations and deepen the impact of grants made here in Maine. And one of our goals is to also just be expanding philanthropy in the state of Maine. And we believe that the integration of diversity, equity, and inclusivity practices is essential and imperative to the success of our work. I also want to acknowledge that we are showing up today in this virtual space in a pandemic, during a sustained racial justice movement, and in an election week where it's pretty challenging and emotional for many. It's a lot, and I'm glad our numbers are still going up. We have over 110 people here this morning, and so I'm glad that you're here, and I welcome you to just take a few collective deep breaths together and land here in this space. Maybe one more for good measure. And I invite you all to be present for the next hour or so. Turn off your devices if you feel like that is an option for you. Maybe close off your news alerts to really be present and learn from one another. And if you haven't already, please drop your name, pronouns, and organization into the chat. And you are welcome to use the chat throughout our time together. You can put in questions, accolades, any kinds of things can go in there. And you can also use the question and answer feature at the bottom as well. Any questions, and just because we had that IT glitch at the beginning, any questions that aren't answered today, I'll just be collecting those, gathering the responses and sending them out in follow-up communication. So if you have a question, feel free to get it in there. We'll do our best to get to it. And let's see, this a couple more housekeeping things. So this event is going to be recorded and sent out after the event. And if you haven't before, Zoom has a great captioning option that you're welcome to use as well. And it should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And just a couple of introductions today. So first we have Jeanette Andre, she, hers. She's the president and CEO of MPC, and she'll be giving a ton of tech support today as we navigate this webinar for the first time, this webinar platform. Thanks, Jeanette. And then we have our wonderful panelists who are giving up their time this morning to be here to talk about giving in Maine. And I'll do a fuller introduction of them in just a few minutes, but their individual perspectives on giving in Maine are going to be super helpful. So we have Dana Baldwin, she, her, from the Samuel L. Cohen Foundation. She's the program officer there. We have Wendy Alt, she, her, the executive director from the Melmac Education Foundation here in Maine. And we have Julie Smith Bartoloni, she, her, the senior director of philanthropy at the Boston Foundation. So thank you all so much for being here. And finally, we have Robert Burnett. Hi, Robert. Good morning. Robert is the administrative and research manager here at MPC. He's also the lovely creator of the reports we are here to talk about, and is just an amazing data container. So super excited to hear his thoughts. So I'm going to turn it over to him to talk more about these reports and the findings in them. Just a little bit of context on the report. So these are things that we generate every year to really help create a snapshot of the millions of dollars that are being invested here in Maine by both individuals and foundations. After Robert presents, we'll turn it over to a short question and answer before going into the full panel discussion. So that said, Robert, I'm going to turn it over to you, and everybody else. I'm going to put the link to the reports in the chat. So if you want to access them while we're talking, you are more than welcome. All right, Robert, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. And I also want to thank everyone for joining us today, and our panelists for joining us. And I look forward to the discussion that we're going to have after I go through these reports for a few minutes. I'm going to start us out with some context at the national level. So at the national level, in 2018, we had $427.7 billion in total charitable giving. That represents about 2% of the national GDP. And this was actually a pretty good year as far as national giving. It was led by foundation giving. Individual giving was fairly flat. And the corporate giving was also pretty strong. But you're seeing a breakdown of the proportions of total giving. By and large, the majority comes from individuals, which is at 68% of the total. Foundations making up 18% of the total, corporations 5%, and bequests 9%. For the first time in over 50 years, individual giving was less than 70% of the overall giving. So the slight dip that we experienced at the national level in individual giving was fairly historic in that way. And so we're seeing a slight increase now in the proportion of foundation giving, with potentially a new trend forming in individual giving. Some major events that happened in 2018 that are really important to keep in mind are tax policy changes, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and a stock market correction that happened at the end of 2018. And then the political situation and economic uncertainty at the national level as well are all important factors that went into the charitable trends at the national and state level. So as we move into this next slide, you can see the actual change from 2017 to 2018. Foundations, by and large, were the strongest performers with an annual change of 7.3%. Bequests were pretty flat, and corporate giving increased by about 5%. And then this one somewhat concerning figure, the dip by 1.1% in individual giving. It was the first time in several years that individual giving did not grow between 3 and 6%. And overall, the total was fairly muted, with total charitable giving growing at about 4.3%. Note that this data is coming from Giving USA, and these were estimates at the time. So the way that these numbers actually panned out over the last couple of years could be slightly different from these original estimates. So now let's jump into the Maine numbers. So in Maine, for fiscal year 2018, we had 375 active private and community foundations, who collectively held $3.3 billion in assets. And charitable giving in the US and abroad was at $211 million. Just to note, the active foundations are those that reported charitable giving for the year. So now, before, so now to see Maine's numbers in comparison to the national numbers, we have 866 million total charitable giving in Maine. Compare that with the 427.7 billion at the national level. That's only 0.2%, which is a pretty small fraction when you think of the total number of states in the country. Maine's total share of charitable giving is relatively small. Some important points that you'll see is the difference in proportion of foundation and individual giving. In Maine, foundation giving made up roughly a quarter of the total, with individual giving at 62%. And then the bequests and corporate shares are equal. The equal shares of bequests and corporate is because we use the Giving USA estimates for our data, because they have a really robust methodology to get at estimates for those numbers. And we just extrapolate those down to Maine. So that could be larger or smaller, but that's the source of those numbers. But traditionally, we do have a smaller share of giving from individuals in Maine and a larger share from foundations. Part of this is due to the fact that in Maine, individual giving generally lags the nation, both in total giving and in average charitable gifts. We're actually second from the bottom in average charitable gifts reported on tax returns. And so that is certainly a driving factor in the difference in percentages you see here. So these are numbers, these main numbers are from a mixture from a couple of different years. Our foundation data was from fiscal 2018, but the individual data actually comes from 2017. And this is just because traditionally our reports and the timing of when we release the reports in the springtime meant that some data was not available. And so we had to take what was available at the time. And that was generally data from individuals from 2017. So with the foundation data, it's typically on a 2-year lag. The individual report was generally on a 3-year data lag. This year, things changed with the pandemic and a number of other factors. We released our reports later than usual. And this was actually a bit of a boon because we were able to pull in a better data set, more complete data, both for foundations and start to get a picture of individual giving from 2018. So while our individual giving report, as it is currently published, does include 2017 data, and that's what you're seeing here in the orange graph, I do want to incorporate some of the more recently released 2018 data for individual giving, because it's really important with 2018 being such a landmark year for giving patterns and tax policy, and we're seeing potentially the beginning of some major trend shifts that in the next slide, we're actually going to compare 2017 and 2018 data. So on the left-hand side, we have the graph that you just saw. That was with individual giving data from 2017. When we incorporate 2018 data, there's a big shift downward. Total charitable giving was 639 million. And that was largely driven by the dip in individual charitable giving as reported on tax returns. This was due in large part to tax policy with the standard deduction doubling. Many households had no incentive to actually itemize their charitable giving on their returns, and this led to a significant decrease in the number of households that actually itemized their deductions and reported charitable giving. This was in 2017 in Maine, 134,520 returns were reported that reported charitable contributions. In 2018, that dropped to 37,730. That's a 72% reduction in Maine households actually reporting charitable giving. In 2018, 20% of Maine households claimed charitable deductions. Sorry, in 2017, 20% of Maine households claimed charitable deductions. In 2018, that percentage dropped to 5.7%. This drop was in the same direction, but more extreme than the national numbers. At the national level, there was a 61% reduction in the number of returns reporting charitable contributions. So as you can see in the graph, the shift in reported giving in 2018 really drastically changes the proportion of giving that is now attributed to foundations and individuals. However, the true picture isn't as drastic as it looks. Just because there's a lack of itemized giving shown in 2018, that doesn't mean there's a lack of giving. It just makes our task of quantifying and reporting on the full value of individual giving a much more difficult task. Some silver lining to this, Giving USA did cite a few reports from 2018 that generally remained positive about giving to nonprofits in that year, with moderate to large organizations seeing flat or positive growth in their gifts. However, the smaller nonprofits did not have as good of a picture, with many nonprofits with under 1 million in gifts experiencing decreased giving in 2018. So there's a mixed picture there. Okay, so this next slide, we can compare now the national giving changes with the Maine giving changes. And for this, we're actually using that fiscal year 2018 data because that is on par with the national data, which is for 2018. So for foundations, Maine also experienced really strong foundation giving growth. At 9.3%, we actually outpaced the national growth rate. At the individual giving level, we again see a big reduction, a drop in 36.6%. That does look a lot more of a drop than the national drop of 1.1%. But it is important to keep in mind that for our methods, our individual giving data is based solely off of itemized deductions as reported on IRS tax returns, whereas Giving USA methods include itemized and non-itemized giving through some robust surveying and other methods. So what you can't see here for the Maine individual giving is that share of giving that is non-itemized. So for all those households that did not have an incentive to report their charitable giving on their tax returns, there was still a lot of giving that pretty much just went under the radar in 2018. And so it will take a few years for us to actually find out how these tax policy changes impact charitable giving at the individual level going forward. All right, so some key points here. For foundations, we saw a strong increase in foundation assets and giving. The assets grew 3.2%, which was on par with national growth. And foundation giving grew 9.3%, which was above the national rate of 7.3%. Education spending leads the sectors, which was followed by human services and health. Education grants make up the largest share at 39% of the total foundation giving, followed by human services at 23% of the total, and then health at 14%. A note about education, or just in general, a pattern we saw was that a small number of recipients receive a large share of the funds. Education dollars overwhelmingly go to a small number of recipients, and 1% of all the recipients receive 40% of the total funding, and half of those are educational institutions. Geographics, funding is flowing to all 16 counties in Maine, but half of the county totals are actually driven by 3 or fewer recipients. That means that 3 or fewer recipients are actually receiving more, 50% or more of the total funds flowing into the county. And then lastly, for foundation giving, we're seeing that donor advised funds are really boosting funding from out of state. As you will see on the back page of the foundation report, just from the top 10 of the out of state donors to Maine, we've got 35 million coming in from donor advised funds. And there's a lot more that are coming in that weren't in that top 10. So that's a trend we're seeing that'll be interesting to see how it pans out going forward, especially given the major changes we saw in 2018. Now, some key points for the individual giving report, including both data for 2017 and 2018. We did see a large drop in the reported giving by individuals. While reported giving increased 8% from 2016 to 2017, it did decrease by 37% in 2018. That said, many people likely gave on par with the prior year, but simply didn't need to report it on their tax return. Also, the average annual giving is trending upward, but still lags the nation. In 2017, the average total charitable giving per household was $3,964, and it was 9% greater than the prior year. In that year, only Rhode Island had a lower average total. In 2018, average giving jumped all the way up to $8,956, but it still remained low compared to other states. Maine was 6th from the bottom in 2018. A big trend that we're seeing both in Maine and at the national level is wealthy donors are accounting for an increasing share of total charitable giving. It's growing, giving from the wealthy is growing faster than giving from low and moderate income households. The trends we're seeing across the state are mixed. Many counties are seeing increases in giving, but some are declining, including 3 in 2017 that saw declines in giving. And then finally, last but not least, individuals, whether we're looking at 2017 or 2018, they still make up the largest source of charitable giving. So in either case, at least 2/3 of all Maine charitable giving comes from individuals, including bequests. And they make up a really crucial part of the Maine charitable giving landscape and are critically important to the health of nonprofit work in Maine. So there were a few changes in our reports this year that I've listed here. I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A or after our session today about this and other elements of the report, but I won't go into any more detail about these details so that we can jump right into our Q&A.
Beautiful. Thank you, Robert. Oh, am I echoing to anybody else or just me? Okay, it stopped. Great. Robert, I have a couple of questions that have come in through the Q&A. One person was curious if IRAs, contributions from IRAs, are included in the individual giving numbers. I wasn't sure if that was something you knew or not.
If contributions from IRAs included in individual giving,
yes.
That is something I am not actually sure about. There may be someone here that does know the answer to that question, but I don't.
Okay, that's all right. We can also we'll do some digging and follow up on that piece. And let's see, Margaret McNamara looks like she's curious, what were the 3 main counties that saw declines in giving in 2018? I don't know if you know that off the top of your head, Robert.
The 3 counties that saw declines off the top of my head, I don't know, but I can get that answer to you in just a few moments.
Beautiful. And I've put it in the chat a couple of times, but just to make sure everybody knows, you will get access to these slides, to the recording, and we're also going to be just collecting a list of all of these questions and responses to share out with folks. For the donor advised funds, so a couple of questions just around if people are giving in different ways, just more for tax reasons. So giving through donor advised funds or other ways for tax reasons.
Sorry, can you repeat the question there?
Yes, if, hold on one second. Let me just get the actual question in front of me. Let's see, if people are giving in different ways because of tax reasons.
So in 2018, the tax landscape for many American households changed. And so that has certainly changed behavior as we saw this huge drop in number of returns actually reporting charitable contributions. However, other decisions that are being taken because of other elements of tax policy, say like how much disposable income households have, which is an important factor in many Americans' charitable giving decisions. That is something I don't have the information on now, that we're probably going to see start to play out over the next couple of years. But I'm eager to hear if anyone else on our panel has any thoughts on that one.
Yeah, beautiful. Especially Julie might have some insight. So I'll just give a couple more beats here to see if anybody has any questions on the reports that haven't been answered. Are there any age breakdowns for individual giving?
No, I don't have any age breakdowns. We had breakdowns of, across geography and across income brackets, but not by age. That is something that Giving USA, with their methodology, they're able to break down some of those patterns at the national level, but we don't have the methods in our current reporting to break things down by age.
Beautiful. And Leslie Good asked if we have a slide we could show, which we don't in this presentation, but I do think that this, because of the changes that might be happening in individual giving, we might follow up with another conversation to dig more into that. But Leslie asked if there was any county level data that could be shared afterwards. Is that, I know there's some in the report itself, but wasn't sure, Robert, if you could, if there are any other resources on the top of your mind.
County level data for individual giving or both?
The question does not signify one way or the other.
Okay, so we do have a breakdown of county level giving in our foundation report that breaks things down pretty in detail. And then in individual giving, we do have also a county level breakdown of deductions by county. And so if there's additional questions that aren't available in either of those reports, then I'm happy to investigate those further.
Beautiful. And I just added the links to those reports again in the chat so people can access them. Let's see. I thought that I had a question that just came in. Hold on one second. Are family foundations included in the foundation numbers?
Yes. In the foundation numbers, that includes community foundations, family, private, independent, a lot of different ways that we break down and categorize foundations. But one of the things that is not included in the foundation numbers at the summary statistics level would be grant-making public charities. So this is one of the nuances of our foundation report, where on the front page in our overall state numbers, we do use the more narrower definition that does not include the grant-making public charities. However, once you go into the inside of the report, we kind of move into a new definition of Maine funder, which includes all the traditional foundation types as well as grant-making public charities.
Beautiful. And I think we've got one last question, a couple of questions about what it means for the fiscal year. So Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, but everybody reports on their own individual fiscal year, and then we look at that data as a set. So it's not from our fiscal year or a calendar year, it's whatever the foundations in say is their fiscal year, and that's what we're looking at. Is that correct, Robert?
That is correct. So it's not based on the calendar year, in this case of 2018, but for each foundation individually, what their fiscal year is. And then from the individual side, it is the data year coming out of the IRS. And so if it was reported in 2019, then from the IRS data, they're reporting on their 2018 financials.
Wonderful. Thank you for that clarification. And I think we're going to go ahead and transition now to our panelists so that we can get all of their insight. But again, if you still have questions that pop into your mind, go ahead and put them in the Q&A and we will follow up afterwards. And Robert is also available and such a wealth of knowledge. So we're super excited to have him. All right. Thank you so much, Robert. So now I would like to introduce our panelists a little bit more. So first we have Dana Baldwin. Dana, you want to give a wave? Okay, beautiful. Dana has been the program officer at the Sam L. Cohen Foundation since 2015. Before working in philanthropy, she had a 30-year career working in art museums across the country, including leading the Learning and Interpretation Department at the Portland Museum of Art for nearly 20 years. Dana is a board member of Pineland Farms and the Portland Public Library. Welcome, Dana. We also have Wendy L. Alt, Executive Director of the Melmac Education Foundation. Wendy is a Maine native, former reproductive health teacher and assistant director of admissions at Westbrook College in Portland, Maine. She also served as the associate director of admissions at the University of Maine at Farmington for 17 years. During her tenure at UMF, she was elected to 4 terms in the Maine House of Representatives. Okay, so you've been in a lot of different places, Wendy. That's exciting. And in September of 1999, Wendy became president of the nonprofit Maine Educational Loan Marketing Corporation. That's Melmac. And then in December of 2000, Melmac was converted from a nonprofit student loan agency to a for-profit company, and then was subsequently acquired. And then the proceeds from the sale were used to form the nonprofit Melmac Education Foundation. And Alt has served as executive director ever since. She lives in Wayne with her husband and her 2 children. And finally, we have Julie Smith Bartoloni from Boston Foundation. She's the senior director of philanthropy there. Julie joined the Boston Foundation in 2012. Her role as Senior Director of Philanthropy Group. She oversees cultivation and stewardship of new and existing donors to the foundation. Julie leads the team that works with fund holders to help them achieve their charitable and philanthropic goals. She's a graduate of Brandeis University, holds a Master of International Business Administration from the European School of Economics, and is a chartered advisor in Philanthropy Cap. Welcome all of our panelists. So I would love to hear just from each of you individually, if you could just give a brief overview of your foundation and the type of giving you do in Maine. And Julie, when we get to you, if you want to talk a little bit about the donor advised funds as part of your giving, that would be awesome. So Dana, why don't we go ahead and start with you, and then we'll just kind of work down the line here.
Sure. Thanks for having me, MPC, and nice to be connecting with nonprofit and philanthropy colleagues across the state, even though it is in this unusual webinar setting. I look forward to when we can all be under one roof again together and celebrating all the great work everyone is doing. And in the meantime, I'm the program officer at the Sam L. Cohen Foundation, and the Cohen Foundation was founded in 2005, and we make grants through kind of a traditional grant making, 2 cycles each year, responsive grants of up to $50,000. Our average grant is $15,000, and we have 5 giving priorities: health and human services, civic and community, education, arts and culture, and Jewish culture and traditions. And our largest portion of giving within those responsive grants is towards health and human services. Each grant cycle, the bulk of our funds end up supporting a range of things: basic needs to access to care, food programs, shelter programs, transportation, etc., but always focused in York and Cumberland County. When we do make a grant to an organization that serves the whole state, it is most likely targeted to the work that is designated for those 2 counties in southern Maine.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dana. Wendy, would you like to go next? Wendy, you're on mute. That's all right.
That doesn't stop me from talking, even when I'm muted. Sarah, thank you so much. And Robert, that was a fabulous segue to our panel. Thank you. That was really rich information that I appreciate. So the Melmac Education Foundation is a very strategic organization. The board of directors is extremely focused on increasing the number of Maine citizens who have an education credential beyond high school. And over the years, we have really broadened our focus to include apprenticeship opportunities, certificates, anything beyond high school that includes a 2 or 4 year degree at a college is now included. So our focus is very much college and career ready. We are very fortunate to be funding and have funded in the past every county in Maine, and I will talk more about that later. Our target audience for funding is middle schools, high schools, adult ed programs, career and technical education centers, and post-secondary institutions, all in Maine. And many of my peers in philanthropy and in the foundation world say that I'm in a position of luxury in that I do not raise money. We have a corpus, and so the board is very committed to ensuring that we comply with the IRS regulations and spend 5%. So that gives you a snapshot of the Melmac Education Foundation.
Beautiful. Thank you, Wendy. And Julie?
Hi, thank you so much for being here, for letting me be here today. I feel like one of these things is not like the others, and I'm slightly the outsider definitely today, but hello from Boston. So I'm representing the Boston Foundation, which is one of around 750 community foundations around the country. I saw several colleagues from the Maine Community Foundation on the call today. The Boston Foundation is one of the oldest. We're over 100 years old. We have over $1 billion in charitable assets. About 1/3 of that is in our endowment or our permanent fund for Boston, which is the money from which our program officers are able to make grants in and around Greater Boston. And about 2/3 of that money is primarily in donor advised funds. Donor advised fund holders can give and do give pretty much anywhere around the country to a 501c3, sometimes around the world, but about 75 to 80% of our grants do go to Massachusetts, of which over 90% go to Greater Boston. So that's the Boston Foundation. And I think the primary reason that, that I was asked here today is because one of our donor advised fund holders who will remain anonymous by choice, has given over $10 million from their donor advised fund since 2009. And that money has all gone specifically to down East Maine or Washington County for a variety of reasons. And it's been a really exciting project that we at the Boston Foundation had an opportunity to work on, because here is a donor who came to us where we know we are not experts in Maine. And so that's when we have an opportunity to come to you who are experts and talk to colleagues at both the Maine Community Foundation and other nonprofits to learn about who is doing what and how we can help to really advise and assist this donor in making the impact that they wish to make. We definitely do have a variety of donors who give to Maine from their donor advised funds. So I was really interested, Robert, in seeing the statistics that you were sharing. Primarily those donors tend to be people who have some sort of familial connection to the state and or vacation homes in the state or alma maters in the state. And that's where we tend to see the bulk of their giving going. I'd say it does align a lot with what Robert was sharing. A lot of giving to basic needs, human services, heating assistance, land conservancy, colleges, definitely in that education space. And more recently, scholarships, sometimes through the Maine Community Foundation, and also their COVID fund and other COVID efforts recently.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Julie. And we've just gotten a couple of questions about kind of the impact of COVID, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes as time allows. But I was curious, and Julie, you kind of spoke to the trends that you've been seeing and kind of where your funding is going, which was great. I'm curious if Dana, if you could also do the same. So kind of as a foundation that's really concentrating in Cumberland and York County, like what are the trends that you have been seeing in the last year or so?
Well, I guess in the last couple of years, I was thinking about this question and, just first, I think you can't underestimate the impact of state and federal policy on the work that the nonprofit community is doing and on individuals living in Maine. So I could talk for a long time about what I saw, with the shifts in Maine care eligibility for adults under the LePage administration and what that the kinds of requests we got from healthcare providers and clinics, and then with Maine care expansion, what trends evolved after, the impact on access to care with Maine care expansion. But I was just thinking of two things that I've seen in the last couple of years specific to York and Cumberland County. And one has to do with the increase in the number and strength and increased visibility for nonprofits that are founded by and led by and serving immigrant and refugee communities, especially in Greater Portland. I think that because that's a growing and established population in Greater Portland, that foundations like the Broadreach Fund, Maine Initiatives, the People of Color Fund at the Maine Community Foundation, those are philanthropic organizations that have provided some leadership support to some of the younger organizations that are led by people of color that have made a real positive impact on the larger community and their specific communities that they serve, and that increased visibility for those organizations has helped foundations like the Cohen Foundation and others that have broad missions really, it lets us support those organizations in a way that can be helpful to the whole community. In the last couple of years, there are a number of funders groups in Maine, Early Childhood Funders Group and the Maine Oral Health Funders Group and others. And recently there's an addition to that network of an Immigrant and Refugee Funders Group. And I think that that those increasingly emerging strong organizations, because they are doing such good work and they're so uniquely qualified to have the most impact in the community. It has positioned those organizations, they were positioned to really take on a lot of the work that needed to be done, in particular moments of crisis. 2 years ago, or was it only last summer, that we had the influx of asylum seekers at the expo, and then this summer with the COVID-19 crisis and the disproportionate impact on communities of color, especially in Greater Portland and Lewiston. I think the growing number and the growing strength of those organizations is something that stands out to me as a kind of a recent development. And just one other thing quickly that I was thinking about regarding that question, Sarah, is I am seeing in the last couple of years growing partnerships that are not necessarily shared missions per se in terms of a collaboration, but instead organizations finding where there's a potential overlap in services so that they are able to increase their delivery in new and interesting ways. So things like the City of Portland has an ESOL collaborative where the many organizations that are providing English language acquisition programs determined who was doing what and where the gaps were, and figuring out how there can be a kind of a shared curriculum so that someone could almost graduate from one program to the next, and rather than competing with each other for students. Portland Public Library has found ways to have bookmobile stops coincide with food programs and food delivery programs. So that's something that I think is growing out of deepening need in the community and stronger nonprofits that are able to find the connections and increase their impact that way. So just 2 thoughts about what's happening in Southern Maine.
Beautiful. All those things sound really exciting. And Wendy, how about you, kind of as someone who is, investing in all 16 counties of Maine? What are the trends that you've been seeing?
Well, a significant trend that I've observed over the years is an increased attention to education attainment in Maine. And to Dana's point, much deeper partnerships exist now, much more collaboration around the whole idea of increasing students' aspirations and also their college and career focus work. In particular, I've observed much more business interest, and I commend Educate Maine being directed by Jason Judd now with all the work that they are doing to bring the business community into the conversations about education beyond high school. And in particular, for Melmac, we have a much deeper partnership with the Jobs for Maine's Graduates program, where we are actually funding in a very intentional way, more college access personnel in 5 high schools in Maine. And recently the board at Melmac has moved into an Aspire program. And so we're working very closely with 2 communities in Maine and hope to really broaden that. But we have 2 Aspire programs, Aspire Gorham, and in Bucksport, they have an Aspire Golden Bucks program where communities are working pre-K through 16 to expose their students to more apprenticeship opportunities and trying to show them some of the options that they have beyond high school. It was interesting yesterday talking to Julie about Maine students and their aspirations. And sometimes, they know what they can see out their window, so to speak, in a very general way. And so it's sometimes a challenge to get them out of their hometown to expose them to some of the other opportunities in Maine.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Wendy. And I'm keeping an eye on time. We have about 10 minutes left. It's going so fast. So Julie, I would love to hear from you if you want to talk a little bit about how your funding has shifted since kind of the onset of the COVID pandemic and the strengthened racial justice movement. So what changes have you seen? And if there's anything that you anticipate kind of as we move into this next year.
Just a small question.
Yeah, just a small question, real quick.
Well, I think, just thinking about earlier in the conversation, there were some questions about DAFs and why are people leaning towards DAFs? How are DAFs being used? I definitely believe that I see that DAFs have increased tremendously over the last 5 and 10 years. Some of it is for tax reasons, without a doubt. Some of it is also for convenience and the ability to sort of put all your money at one time when you have some money and then be able to give it out over time more thoughtfully. Sometimes DAFs get criticized for not putting out enough money, and that is not what we have seen personally at the Community Foundation, but I know that it does happen as there are hundreds and hundreds of custodians of donors at donor advised funds. But certainly we did see in this last year, with the multiple pandemics all converging upon us at once, that donor advised funds as rainy day funds certainly held up, because donors just started giving at a level that was really unprecedented for us. Our donor advised funds last fiscal year gave almost $170 million in grants. And in the months between March and June, the grant making was 5 times what it had been in the same time the year prior, because donors just saw that if they had money to give, even if their own personal lives had been impacted, if they had lost jobs or lost money in the stock market, the money they had put aside for philanthropic charitable capital was still there. And so they were able to access it immediately and get it out the door. Certainly as the foundation immediately created a COVID-19 response fund, as so many community foundations and other organizations did. Ours was incredibly well funded. I think it raised about $12.5 million in a very short time. We've granted out over 8 million of that and are now working on a phase 2 to be able to support an equitable and just recovery, really looking at the issues of racial equality and racial equity that are so visible now to so many to whom it wasn't visible before. And then just in the name of time, a couple of trends that we as a foundation have really paid attention to in our own giving from the COVID fund is the need to be more flexible, to shift to more general operating and not program or project based, but really trusting the nonprofits to use the money as they need to use them. Less onerous applications, a lower barrier to access. So really just asking a couple of questions very briefly about the organization, and requiring much less reporting, more of a trust-based approach. If we know this organization, love this organization, trust its leaders, we want to be able to really not ask them to do a lot of extra work to be able to have access to that money, and maintaining a really strong community focus, and focus on who is leading the organization and who the organizations are serving, with our grants going to about 70% of organizations led by BIPOC, by Black, Indigenous, people of color. I'll stop there.
Wonderful, thank you. I feel like you got a lot of information out in that response. So great job for answering that big question. Dana, would you like to also respond to that question in terms of how your funding has shifted since the pandemic's really started, and then kind of anything you anticipate for this next year?
Yeah, well, our board decided kind of like a lot of Maine foundations, our board decided in March and early April that they were going to just start making unsolicited grant awards to organizations that we had funded in the past, and primarily in food programs, shelter programs, basic needs. And so, between April and maybe July or late June, we made about $500,000 in grants to organizations. And it was just, as Julie was saying, it was just about, the quick ability to just get checks out the door to various organizations. And then they allotted a second portion of funds to our fall grant cycle. And we added a new giving priority related to COVID response and recovery, but especially, for populations that were vulnerable or made more vulnerable as a result of the virus. And so we're actually almost at the tail end of that fall grant cycle, and our board meeting's coming up this weekend, in fact. And then the other thing that we did in the quick response was, in addition to adding that giving priority, the COVID focus for the fall grant cycle, we lifted an eligibility barrier that is usually in place where organizations who'd received a grant from us in the previous calendar year normally wouldn't be eligible to apply. And we lifted that barrier so that we were able to to consider more applications from Southern Maine. Moving forward, we haven't discussed whether the spring grant cycle is going to have that same COVID focus. And in conversations with organizations, and then we also lifted restrictions, or we worked with grantees from 2019 if they needed to kind of rethink what kind of project or program versus operating support. But we had always made operating support grants. And I do wonder moving forward whether a lot of the Maine-based foundations, our colleagues have made decisions to lift reporting requirements or be more flexible about operating versus project support. And I will be curious moving into 2021 if many foundations decide that they want to move forward with that approach, or if they end up kind of reverting back to similar requirements and restrictions prior to COVID. But yeah, it's very, very interesting time. And one other thing that's been sort of interesting in conversations with grantees is seeing how the focus on food programs in emergency funding, and also in this, into this fall, and how that is, I've heard from a number of organizations that work in youth development that created food programs, out of necessity, just getting it done and doing whatever they needed to do, and their hope that they are able to transition back to their original mission as soon as they can. So just seeing how nonprofits are having to also be adjusting, and the emergency need, and now the need as we head into this next phase. It's quite interesting to see.
Yeah, and I think you both have just really highlighted very well the ways that nonprofits have been pivoting and the ways that foundations have been pivoting to decrease the barriers to access, which I think is, a conversation that we are definitely involved in and want to continue for sure. Wendy, I would love to hear from you about how your funding has changed and what this next year might look like for you.
Well, the board has elected to stay true to its mission, but also has given me a lot of direction to stay as closely connected to our grantees as we can. And so we are attempting to be responsive to their immediate needs regarding COVID, and being very flexible about how they may edit their original grant application to address some of the COVID challenges that no one could have anticipated. Much as Julie described, we recently sent out a survey to all of the colleges that had a grant from us previously to check in with them about how COVID might be impacting their student success. And we learned that there was a a significant need for emergency funds for colleges to make available to students for COVID-related emergencies. And so we adopted the same sort of application process that Julie described. We tried to make it as simple as possible so we could just get the money out the door to the colleges. So, you know, we're attempting to stay very nimble and responsive to all of their needs, but staying true to our focus of trying to increase the number of Maine citizens that have an education credential.
Beautiful, beautiful. And we are coming to the end. So I think just because we lost that bit of time, I think we maybe not have time for a live Q&A, but if you folks want to just add any questions into the question and answer box, I will be following up with these panelists to get more information on topics and kind of what to expect from MPC after this. So we'll send out an email with the slides, with the recording. Thanks, Jeanette. And also a link to upcoming programs. We have a lot that will be offered soon that has to do with a lot of the topics that we talked about today. So please check that out. And if you're interested in becoming a member of MPC, feel free to reach out to me directly. You can also reach out to Robert with questions about data. But thank you all so much for joining us and being present and interactive and engaged this morning with so much going on in the world. So we hope to see you soon and have a lovely day. Thank you all again so much.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Dana, Julie, Robert.
Thank you all.
Enjoy the day.
Beautiful. I'm going to stay in the link just for a little bit longer, but if panelists, well, we can actually debrief if folks want to for a minute after we